Hello, I'm Bonnie Stacy, Chief Curator of the Martha's Vineyard Museum. When we installed the Women's Works exhibit in March 2020, we had no idea what the year had in store, and it turned out that the pandemic forced the museum to close just 1 week after the exhibit opened. And then when we reopened in August, it was in a much changed environment. As a result, not very many people were able to go through the exhibit before it closed in October 2020. That's one reason we were thrilled and honored when Abigail McGrath agreed to talk about the women whose work was featured in the exhibit. Every one of these women had a connection to Martha's Vineyard. They lived here year-round or in the summer, and they worked here, some as homemakers who were skilled in the textile arts of embroidery, quilting, and rug making, and some as professional photographers, painters, or sculptors. Abigail herself has strong ties to Martha's Vineyard. She has spent summers here from childhood, and she founded Renaissance House, a retreat for writers, poets, and other artists. She knew some of the women whose work was in this exhibit, including Lois Miller-Jones and Ella Tulin, and she has stories about them. I hope you enjoy them as much as I did.
Hi, I'm Abigail McGrath. And when my mother died, my mother was a poet in the Harlem Renaissance. I thought, well, what would be a nice thing to memorialize her? And I thought, you know what? I'll start a retreat, and I did. The retreat is called Renaissance House. It's for writers of social issues, and writers can come up there and not worry about things and just write. Okay, so the reason I did that was because when my mother and my Aunt Dorothy West, who also lived on the island, when they were younger, they could not sell their work. My mother worked for Consumer Reports, Dorothy worked as a cashier in Edgartown, but the idea of earning a living on your art was something that men could do, but women could not. This show, which Bonnie has so intelligently put together, shows the trend of women from when they couldn't sell their work and they had to give it away, or they chose to give it away, to women who could command high sums and live quite well. They never make as much as the men, but nevertheless, they can live well as an artist. That's very important to note. At that retreat that I talked about before, I would ask the women questions and the men questions, and it was so clear that men really valued their work more than women. And the question was, when do you write? The women would all say, I write in the morning before I make breakfast and the whole house has woken up. Or they would say, I write in the evening after everyone's gone to bed. Or we had a poet who worked for us who was a maid in a hotel. And she wrote at lunch hour, she'd go into the bathroom stall, lock the stall, so that she could write. Men don't do that. Men work at their offices, and when they feel like the spirit hits them, they pull out that manuscript and they start working on it there. Men, if they're painters or something like that, they don't go in that day. They stay home, they start painting in the morning, they stop painting when the sun comes down, and that's that. A woman, let's do it the other way around. If a man is a good cook, he becomes a chef. If a woman is a good cook, she becomes a wife. Or, my mom really makes apple pie better than anybody else. Never in their wildest dreams did Jane Worth, Nellie Pierce, or Nancy, Michaels, who was a slave, that's why her name was really Nance, ever think that their work would be shown behind glass in a museum. Jane, who did this crocheted mitt, and Nellie all treated it not for the intricacy and the beauty of the work, but simply as a utilitarian thing. This lovely, lovely blanket, which is painfully shy, and lovely, lovely blue trim around it, is accredited to Nance, who was a familiar slave on the island, and she We don't know whether or not she did it, but what we do know that the value of the blanket is not in the artistic work of the blanket. That's the point I'm trying to get to. It's in the fact that there's a note attached to it and that it might have been done by her. But no one ever talks about the actual work. Sometime between the 1700s and the 1800s, textiles became a sign of stature, and the trends changed, and suddenly women's work was worth money, and linen sheets cost as much then as a mahogany table did at that time. This purse here and the embroidery that is on it, they were durable and clearly long-lasting, but not frameable. They were not considered art or even a craft. They were just taken for granted. So, women at this time started to realize that they could sell their work as well as give it away. Very important period. Okay, so now, good little Vineyard girls made samplers. Now, a sampler is, well, you can see in the picture there, it's a sample of the stitches that you take, that you can make, and they have to be pretty and all, because from that on, you're going to go to a big piece of seamstressing, right? And it was important to have a good sampler to show people so that when you went to make the dress, they would know what kind of dress it was. And it was also a requirement for getting married. That's the wrong way to put it. It was like, you had to be a good cook and you had to be a good seamstress and maybe you could play the piano. It was one of those kind of things. So the better your sampler was, the better chance of getting a husband was. Okay, so the Luce and Norton, which are very, very old Vineyard names, made these samplers, and I'm sure that they have relatives sitting out there right now who have them up on the walls. But what they didn't realize was that the samplers themselves were worth almost as much as the work that they did. Certainly that they were worthwhile. Lizzie Fisher. Now, you know that Fisher House on Main Street in Edgartown, great big house where they have weddings and catered affairs. That's her father. Dr. Daniel Fisher is Lizzie Fisher's father. And she and Nancy Smith made these quilts. Now, we all know how difficult it is to make quilts and how geometric they are. The difference is, in those days, I think they actually put them on the bed, and these days, they put them on the wall. They frame them because they know how valuable they are. But they were not valuable at that time, and you couldn't make a living making quilts. Island-born Mary Jackson worked as a scalloper with her husband, Paul Jackson. And during the off-season, she would show her exquisitely made hook rugs at the Ag Fair. Sarah Mayhew came from another island family, which still has an enormous presence on the island. In fact, the woman who takes care of me at the bank is a Mayhew. And in 1835, Sarah made a stencil on velvet. Not quite like the little doggies that everyone thinks about now with stencils on velvet, but the doggies made more money than Sarah did, even in, when you adjust for the time. Theorem painting was very big and still is. When women went to art school, they started to realize the worth of their work. And either them or their parents who paid for the art school, right? Because they thought either that they would be able to sell their work or marry an artistic husband. Actually, when I went to college, my father said exactly that to me. He said, "What do you want to go to college for? To marry a rich husband?" And that was a major reason why women went to college, except for art school. And at art school, they could develop what they always loved to do. Miriam Richardson was trained as an artist at an art school. She went to the Vesper George School of Art in Boston in 1933, which is when the Depression was in full swing. And for a while, she did earn a living as a commercial artist. When she moved back to the Vineyard, and we all do move back to the Vineyard, she became a stay-at-home artist, and she just painted in East Chop. Like Jane Worth, she concentrated on embroidery, except Miriam's work was frameable as well as durable. Mabel Johnson, who lived in West Tisbury, made rag rugs. And in keeping with the girls who did the quilts, A rag rug is made out of old coats and old pants and wool and things like that, which you cut up or shred up, and then you braid them, and then you sew them all together into a rug with a design. And now Mabel just did that for her friends and gave them away. However, businessmen came along and saw what a practical thing that was, and they started manufacturing braided rugs using Mabel's designs and other women's designs, and didn't share any of the profits with them. So we know that the Navajo women made money making baskets, right? And weaving. But we don't hear much about the Wampanoag women making baskets and weaving and selling them. Jemima Easton, who died in 1868, made this basket. And we know that it had worth because her daughter sold it. And the sad factoid about Jemima Easton is that her husband died, and they owned a lot of land, and once he died, she couldn't vote, because women could not vote in those days. And because she had no voice, and she could not vote, she lost all of her land, and has disappeared off the map. Laura Spear's father was a sea captain, a whaling ship captain, and he would take the whole family on the ship when they went out. So that Laura, when she was 8 years old, pretty much lived on the ship, and she kept a log, and she drew pictures of the flora and the fauna of the sea, and algae and stuff like that, and grew up and had a swell life. But when her husband died, she came back to the island. And we all know what a healing place Martha's Vineyard is, and she settled in Edgartown because she owned a house there. Okay, so she and her son come back to the island, and she's a serious artist. She paints porcelain, which was a big deal in those days. She paints canvases and all sorts of sea images that are lovely. Howsoever, she knows that she cannot earn a living as an artist. So what does she do? She takes her house and she turns it into a tea shop. And in the tea shop, she hangs her work. Now, if she'd been a man, she could have opened a gallery, but she wasn't, but she was smart. So in this tea shop, she sold tea and sandwiches and sympathy and tchotchkes. I call them tchotchkes, she called them work of arts, but that's the deal, is that she was able to hang her work and sell it because she had a tea shop and not a gallery. Edna Reindell. By the time Edna came of age, she was a full-bodied bohemian-type flapper girl living in Greenwich Village and had her hair all bobbed up, and she wore lipstick and for all she could be smoking, for goodness sake, right? The key thing here is that she went to Pratt University, where she was not ashamed of being all those bodacious things, and she was very bold and sure of herself, and guess what? Sold her work. And because she was so sure of herself, and she had gone to art school, and she had a comfortable background, she was able to put her works in the Whitney Museum and the Museum of Modern Art and all sorts of places where it was rare for a woman to show her work. Enid Yandell is another art school graduate. She went to the Cincinnati Art Academy, and she graduated in 1889, so you know that she was like way before the other girls, right? But she did a lot of work in Chicago. However, she didn't really come into her own until she moved to Paris. And when she was in Paris, she hung out with Auguste Rodin. And hanging out with his crowd, she became an artist on her own. And if you look at her work, when she came back to Oak Bluffs in 1907, which was before the town was incorporated. Okay, so you look at the work here. If you look at the piece called The Pioneer, you can see the influence of Rodin on her work. Gretchen Van Tassel Shaw. You know who she is? You know who she's the mother of? That's Allison Shaw's mother. So, of course, Allison Shaw is a big-time photographer, well-respected photographer here on the island. Her mother was a big-time photographer, and she went to Bennington, which meant that she was an independent thinker as a woman, right? Okay, so she goes to Bennington, and she learns how to think independently, and then she is in World War II. And while she's in World War II, She's also a scientist, and they use her for, let me get it straight now, secret sonar work, which is hard, right? Especially for a woman. And after that, the War Relocation Authority assigned her to take photographs of Japanese American citizens which our government forced into internment camps. And these are photographs, so this photograph is of that. Gretchen lived in Edgartown for over 60 years, and Allison, her daughter, has a gallery on Dukes County Road, which is right across the street from my great-great-grandfather. Stella Waitskin, lived on Music Street in West Tisbury for 60 years. However, even though she lived there for 60 years, she was never really treated much like an islander. Stella collected everything, and it was okay because she was a found objects artist. And her house, however, looked like a hoarder's dream come true. And so instead of people calling her crazy as a loon, they said she was eccentric, and they said she was a reclusive. But the fact is that she really did take these things up off the street and make art of them. And in 1970, that was a big deal. People were doing found art all over the place. And as a matter of fact, it's a good thing. She could have been worse. She could have been John Chamberlain and brought in old pieces of metal of cars and put them in the living room and painted them. So her kind of art, which was edgy at the time, is now totally acceptable. And her son, after she passed, was terrific. Everyone should have a son like him. He put all of his stuff into museums, and she was at the Museum of Modern Art, she was at the Corcoran Gallery and the Smithsonian, and you can say she's as crazy as a loon, but the fact is she was crazy as a fox. Magda Polivanov. Okay. This is a good one. You ready? Magda lived in Greenwich Village on Morton Street. My mother lived in Greenwich Village on 210 Thompson Street, okay? The guy who lived next door to my mother was a handsome young man who was very kind to my mother because they lived in a 7-story walk-up, and she would say, I'm going downstairs, can I get you things, and things like that. He also was kind to Magda. And the same thing. He was just simply a kind person. And not to mention, good looking. Very easy on the eye. In fact, my mother wrote a terrific poem about him called He's 22, I'm 63, what a pity, he's so pretty. Okay, so she would give him her poems, and he would say thank you, stuff like that. And so fade out. Okay, now fade back in. We have a pandemic. And like everyone else, he's cleaning out his closet. He cleans out his closet and he comes upon a box with my mom's poetry in it. And he finds me through the internet, and he calls me up and says, listen, I have a box of your mother's poetry that she gave to me 40 years ago, 50 years ago, something like that. And what do you think? And I say, oh, that's terrific. And he says, by the way, do you happen to know a woman named Magda Polivanov? And that's exactly how he said it, by the way. And I said, guess what? I do. Now, the fact is I didn't really know her. But my friends who lived in the campgrounds knew her. And my friends said, when I recalled back, is that the right way to put it? He was, how they all complained down there? Well, this is what he said. Hold on, let me get it so I say it the right way. Oh, yeah, I know her. That's a crazy Russian woman who acts like she's a Tsarina or thinks she's so much. Well, the fact is, it was true. No, she wasn't crazy, and she wasn't a Tsarina. But her father worked as part of Tsar Nicholas's army, and her mother was a lady-in-waiting for the Dowager Empress. Now, that's got to count for something, right? Because how many people have that background? I remember seeing a show of hers here on the Vineyard that was all sparkly and shiny and very theatrical looking. And my husband and I had kid shows that we did in Warburn Park. And I kept, going over and looking at it, and come to find out that her husband had a marionette show And those costumes and curtains and things like that, props, sets and costumes, were for his shows. Now, Magda had, let's say, theatricalism in her blood, would be a nice way to put it. When she and her sister escaped, it was Diaghilev who took her in. Diaghilev, as you know, Serge Diaghilev, yeah, that one, was the head of the Ballet Russe, and he gave her the job of doing the costumes for that. And how did they get together? Because his father was also in the Tsar's military. Okay, now, but she gets to New York City. This is good. She gets to New York City and she has this big, hairy, very ill-mannered Siberian husky dog. Dog's name is Dushka, okay? Dushka means darling in Russian. Okay, mein Dushka, all right. Dushka would like jump up on the furniture and stuff like that, and she had this little tiny apartment on Morton Street, and whenever she said, Dushka, sit, all these Russian guys would sit down because they thought she was talking to them. All righty. Now, Magda did something that I think I'm going to do on my next New Year's Eve party, and it's a great thing. You know, when you don't have... Magda knew how to always be elegant, no matter if she had a lot of money or a little bit of money. And when she was living on Morton Street, she had a little bit of money. But nevertheless, she would have these wonderful, lovely New Year's Eve parties in which she served borscht and champagne. And this is what she would do. At 11:45, she would give everyone a glass of champagne, a piece of paper, a pencil, and a match. And then they would say, okay, write down what you want to happen to you in the next year coming up. Don't say you want to get money. Just say, what kind of wish do you want in the next year? And they would do that. And then when 12 o'clock came, everyone would strike the match, burn the piece of paper, let the ashes fall into the glass of champagne, and then drink the glass of champagne. It's very, I don't know, it's just so sweet. And what was really sweet about it is that when Magda came upon hard times, she would share her meals on wheels, food, dinner, lunch, whatever it was, with the young man and tell him all these terrific, terrific stories. The one that she should have sold to Hollywood, which is really true and scary, is when she and her sister were traveling from Siberia to the Black Sea, and they were in a train, and the train was stopped, and everyone was told to come outside and line up against the train, which they did. And Magda looked down at the line of people, and she could see that they were shooting every fifth person. And she quickly did the numbers and said, oh my goodness, I am the fifth person to be killed here. And so she steeled herself, and she didn't close her eyes, and she didn't start whimpering and crying. She just steeled herself, and when it came to her turn, the guy who looked at her with a bayonet on the thing looked at her, and she looked at him, and their eyes locked, and she didn't do anything. She just froze, and he moved on to the next person. And why is that? Because that guy was a servant for her father, and her father had been very, very kind to him. So what does that teach you a lesson? Always be nice to people. You never know, right? So Magda hung out with all sorts of famous people. Pablo Picasso in Paris, Coco Chanel in London, Lillian Hellman here on the island, and she had a shrink. Can you guess who he was? See if you can guess who Magda's shrink was. That's right! Sigmund Freud! Can you imagine having Freud for your shrink? I can't even think about it. However, this is important, because I don't have a good opinion of him, but he told us something that was really, really revelatory and helpful. He said, in order to soothe out your emotional distress, you must smooth it out through art. Start doing your art and let it take the emotional distress out of you. And so she did. Lois Mayo Jones. Lois's family and my family go back like forever, right? And see this picture of these four little girls here? Okay. The first one is my mother, Helen, and that's Helen Johnson before she was Helene. The second was my Aunt Dorothy West, who's well known here on the island, and that's Aunt Jean, okay? The next one is Lois. My mother never said Lois. They always pronounced her name as Lois, as in Loyce, but it's just easier to call her Lois now because that's what everybody else calls her. Now, these four women beat the odds. They really did. Every single one of them became significant in their field. My mother was a poet from the Renaissance, Harlem Renaissance, as you know. Aunt Dorothy was not only a writer of the Harlem Renaissance, but she also wrote for the Gazette here on the island, and she wrote The Wedding, which is a big Oprah Winfrey hit and a movie, okay? And Jean was always beautiful. Lois, however, beat them all because she was always a significant painter, black or white, before the Harlem Renaissance, after the Harlem Renaissance, and mainstream. And now, why is that? Because these four little girls look as if they're all equal, do they not? Aha, they are not. And what's the difference between the four of them? Lois's father. That's the difference right there. Lois's father was a janitor, and he was a janitor in a school, a college, but it was a law school college. And this is in the early 1900s, right? And he became a lawyer. And you can't imagine what kind of grit it takes to become a lawyer, a black man as a lawyer in those days. And because he could do the impossible, he didn't come from a wealthy family like the other black lawyers and things like that, Lois learned to never ever accept the word no. She would go behind things, around things, underneath things, over things, but she always carried through, despite the racism that she faced, that we all faced at that time, right? Okay, so the confidence that she got from seeing her father become an attorney helped her with the confidence she had in her work. Plus, her parents were terrific. They never said, well, let's do it this way, they always bought her paints and all the things that she needed to be an artist, and what they never said was, sweetheart, why don't you go to secretarial school, just in case this art thing doesn't work out. They always had faith in Lois. Okay, now at age 14, my mother would take the bus from Girls Latin Girls Latin High School, let's get this clear, in Boston, home, do her homework, write a couple of poems, give them out to friends, and go to sleep and read a book, okay? Lois went to let me get this straight now, the High School of Practical Arts, got on the same bus in Boston, but she would go to night school at what's the name of the school? The Boston Museum of Fine Arts. The woman never stopped working. We're talking about 14. By the time she was 17, she had a one-woman show here on the Vineyard. And I don't know what, that's 1920 something, right? I mean, that's like incredible. Okay. She was like the Zora Neale Hurston of the visual world, right? Okay. So she went from there to having the one-woman show, from one prestigious school to the next. And she finally ended up at Howard University in Washington, D.C., and she stayed there for 47 years. Why does one stay in school for such a long time? Because then not only did she have confidence, but she also had an economic base that she could rely upon so that she could spend time doing her art. Many, many, many women artists teach and had to teach, and you'll see coming up later, Ella did the same thing, in order to survive as a creative person. It is also important to note that she didn't have to send money home, which a lot of the women did at that time. She had a steady income as a teacher, which she could use to survive on. A lot of people, I don't know who, but had to send money home to their parents because they came from impoverished circumstances. I remember having dinner with her at Pat Richardson's house. Pat Richardson is another island artist. And the Oak Bluffs island artists stick together just like the Edgartown island artists did. And I sat next to Lois, and it was like eye-popping. She just looked so good and well put together, and she was wearing this exotic jacket, like all shiny colors, greens and yellows and things put together that were less than subtle. She had her makeup on. Oh, she was something 80-some years old, right? She was wearing her makeup, she had her hair all together, and she was clever and kind and good and funny. Okay, so now I'm not a little girl anymore. I'm a grown-up woman talking to Lois, and I have the strength to say to her, Lois, I've always heard this story about my family. Now, I have a lovely family, as you can imagine. However, we have a lot of artistic license in our family. I didn't say we lied. I didn't say it was a flat-out lie, but we did elaborate quite a good deal, because they were all writers, right? Okay. So I said, did Ethel Waters burn down our house? And she looked flat like that. Yes. So, oh, it was true. So now, I say, I don't think I said, so she just started telling me. I didn't ask her how. She said, so she started telling me how it happened. This is the key thing here, though. If you don't know who Ethel Waters is, you got to Wikipedia her or look her up or something, because she was the highest paid black actress at the time. And she also was a singer, and she's like, she's worth your looking up and to know. But what counts here is that she's very formidable. It's like having Lady Gaga or somebody else at your home, okay? Beyonce, there you go. It's like having Beyonce at your home. Okay, so Rachel West, who was Dorothy's mother, liked to give big fancy parties. And we lived at that time, you know where our market is now, by the water? Okay, so our market was our house. In fact, that whole strip of houses at that time was black. I don't think there's any black person left anymore who lives there, but that's not the story. So we're sitting there. They are sitting there, and it's a big fancy party, and Ethel Waters is sitting on the back porch next to the water, and she lights up a cigarette. Now, it's illegal to smoke, for women to smoke, okay? But even so, it wasn't that illegal. But Dorothy's mother, Rachel, furious, and she starts yelling at her. And nobody yells at Ethel Waters, right? Okay, so Ethel Waters, polite, and she flicks the cigarette butt out into the water. And life goes on. Rachel goes back inside the house to talk to other famous, well-known people, and she smells, and she sniffs, and she smells the smoke again. So she goes racing out to the back porch, and Ethel hears her coming, so she throws the cigarette down between the floorboards. And nothing happens. She gets away with it, and everything's fine until that night when the entire house goes up in flames. Everyone was saved, nobody died, but that's when we moved up to the Highlands, and that's when my mother, Dorothy, and Jean all became, what's the right word? They wouldn't sleep at night without a flashlight or some sort of lantern or something like that next to them, and they were always afraid of burning up in a fire. Lois didn't bother her one bit, and why is that? She had that confidence thing going for her. So I was very happy that she cleared that story up for me. So when Lois told me that story, I wanted her to be one of my aunts, right? Because she was so tender and sensitive and funny and guileless, and I had absolutely no doubt that she was telling the truth. The thing about Lois that's paramount is that she never gave in to racism or confronting it. Now, Corcoran Gallery in Washington, D.C. was having a contest, an award, something like that, and they did not accept the work from African Americans. So most African Americans, knowing that they would not be accepted, didn't apply. Not our girl Lois, oh no. So Lois gets her white friend, what's her name, Celine Tabbery, to enter her painting for her. And of course it won. You knew it was going to win, right? So it's called Indian Shops, Gay Head, Massachusetts. And it won the Robert Woods Bliss Award. Now here's the really sad part, is that Lois could not go up and accept the award. Celine had to accept it and send it to her. An incident like that could make you just a tad bitter. Not our girl Lois. She worked around things. She worked non-confrontationally, and it's how one deals with bitterness that really matters. Not giving into it is the key, and another, sloppy phrase is you got to be in it to win it. But key thing here is don't give up. You can't be regretful, or you can't act on the regretfulness of terrible things that have happened to you in the past. And Lois never gave up in the face of some of the most unspeakable prejudice. Because, as she said to me, she knew that if she did quit, they would win. And she was right. So why give them an easy time? There's another thing in this photo that separates Lois from the other girls. Can you guess what that is? She married well. Oh, if I ever heard that again, I'll scream. And I don't mean in the frivolous way of marrying a wealthy person or anything like that. I mean, or the suburban way of marrying a wealthy person or for security or anything like that. She married a Haitian good-looking man who chased her, if that's the right word, or wooed her for either 10 or 20 years through through pen pal things or whatever. And finally she relented and married this good-looking man. Comes from a good family, had lots of government connections, and had a French accent. It's like, Roger, Essay Levy, like that. You couldn't beat him for being sophisticated and suave. Okay, and because of that, he was able to open many doors for her that enabled her to not just travel, but to meet people who could collect her work. So they went to Haiti, they went to Africa, they lived in France, they lived all over the place, and she could get that famous eye for color at these countries that were unabashedly brass and what I would call, shiny. Okay. Not only that, she was politically active. Of the 4 little girls, once again, my Aunt Jane never read a newspaper in her life. My Aunt Dorothy was a big-time, let's say, conservative. And my mother, Helen, was a armchair radical who talked big, but, never got out there and marched. Lois got out there and marched. And it was just so nice to have like a tante or an aunt who actually put her money or her body where her mouth is. We both marched in protests against racism. We marched against the Vietnam War. We were both very vocal about our beliefs, and we both incorporated our big mouth opinions in our art. I did agit-pop theater on street corners of New York City for, 7 street corners, 7 people, but nevertheless 7 people. And she did this painting called Moon Mask, and which was about maybe 700,000 people saw it. But what counts here is that we both brought thought and shed light on a situation through our art. It was nice, really nice to be able to talk to someone who shared the same beliefs that I did. And for all of that, and rightfully so, Lois has, it's June 29th as Lois Jones Day in Washington, D.C. And today, her works sell for about $75,000, $75,000 to say $100,000. And it's not as much as Jacob Lawrence, but then again, we've always talked about the difference between money and men and women. And what's really important here is that her work is in the White House and revered and makes a statement. Ella Tulin, my buddy-o, yes. I met Ella for the first time at actually I was all grown up, and it was here on the island at the Democracy Symposium in Vineyard Haven. And her daughter came up to me, daughter Leah, came up to me and said, "You should know my mom." And I didn't say why, I didn't give any kind of wisecracks or anything. I said, "Oh, okay, swell." And then in a couple of days, Leah has arranged a play date for me and Ella. And the odd thing is that we got along very well, and we didn't even know each other at the time. So we became really close friends, and I couldn't understand why she would want to be friendly with me. It's true, though. She came from the Bronx, and I came from Brooklyn. We were both only children. She was a little crazy in the head. I was a lot crazy in the head. She was a little left of Democrats, and so was I. But at that time, the entire island was a little, left of being a Democrat. So I didn't get it. And she treated me like a little sister. She would introduce me to her fancy friends, and she would have me over for dinner, and she was just incredibly kind to me. And then I saw her work. And when I saw her work, I said, my God, this woman has been sculpting me before she even met me. Those thighs are my thighs. That tiny little top, that's my tiny little top. And I was just so happy and relieved to find an artist who appreciated my kind of body. I connected immediately, even more so, to her. And because of her, I was no longer body shamed, as they say nowadays. I became proud of my body. I was always embarrassed by pieces like Giacometti's Standing Woman, this little skinny, tall woman. But that was Giacometti and the boys, and now I was with Ella Tulin and the girls. And I wasn't the only one. Lots of women were so relieved to see a piece of sculpture that's flattering, if you will, of a way a body really, really looks. And I really felt privileged that she enclosed me in her little circle of friends. One of her circle of friends was the foundry where they did the brass work for her, and the guy's name is Dominic Ranieri. He had a foundry on Prince Street. Now, at that time, I had a boyfriend on Prince Street who was a composer, and he's a well-known musician named Ornette Coleman. And I said casually to Ella and to Dominic, gee whiz, my friend Ornette lives on this block. And Dominic gave me the look, and Ella says, Dominic plays drums. Why don't you ask Ornette if Dominic can play drums for him? Now, Dominic is a big... Ornette's a big-time fancy musician. I'm not going to ask him if this guy who is an amateur and makes a very good foundry man, I'm no doubt about it, but I was reluctant to do that. But I didn't say anything to the face. I said, okay, sure, I will. Okay, so, and then all of a sudden Dominic is being nice to me, which I'm sure he was before, but he's even nicer now. The key thing here is I was embarrassed. However, I did do, because I would do anything Ella asked me to do, and I went to Ornette's and I said, you know, there's a foundry down there that uses wax, what's it called, some kind of fancy old wax, wax something for the work that's old time, and new people don't do it, and it's from Italy, and it's blah, blah, blah. And he indeed was very, very interested. Now, I didn't tell him that, I think I did. I said Dominic is a drummer, and he likes music and stuff like that. But whether or not they got together, I don't know. But the key thing here is I kept my word to Ella, even though I could have been compromised. Okay? The thing about Ella is that she got you to do stuff. And one of the reasons she got you to do stuff was because she cared so much about you. At that factory, she knew the names of all the guys who worked there. She knew the names of the children. They knew what they were interested in. She knew what they got on their third grade report card. The woman paid attention. Okay? And so you couldn't say no. You simply could not say no to Ella. And it was nice to be included in that way. Ella cast in bronze, which was really, really expensive. So she had to be careful with the things that she cast. And like Magda, art saved Ella's life. Ella didn't have Freud for her shrink, but according to Leah, her daughter, in a letter that she wrote to me, she said, art literally saved my mother's life. She used to tell me that it grounded her and gave her roots. It gave her a way to express herself and her passions and her pain and her emotions. It gave her a voice. Ella's tragic childhood echoes that of Magda's, except that Ella's parents were pogrom survivors. Her mother was in a mental institution for 27 years as a result of the nightmares inflicted on her. Ella was Jewish, and many of her ancestors were killed in the Holocaust. And since she was 4 years old, she was shuttled from one house to another of distant relatives who didn't care very much about her. She went to foster homes and orphan asylums, and just, a very sad way of living. Which may be why she was so kind to others. You don't know. But the fact is that everybody loved Ella until, and they loved her work, until she started doing men. And she would do these large-sized men with adequate penises, and people were like shocked. You could do a woman naked as a jaybird anywhere, and that was fine. But when she started doing naked men, honey, the prickles on the back came out. About 30 years ago at the Arlington office building, they commissioned a piece of Ella's, and it was Adam and Eve. And both of them are naked. And don't you know that the women in that building went to the owner of the building and said that it was pornography? I mean, the women did it, not the men, the women. And they didn't mind that there were pieces of sculptures of women around naked. But a naked man, suddenly that's pornography. I don't know if it would get the same kind of attention today or reaction today. Although, when was the last time you saw a naked man without a fig leaf covering his parts? Not a photograph, a piece of sculpture. Okay. Ella wasn't just an artist who sculpted or painted or things like that. She was an artist in her whole life. And when you went to her house for dinner, she would give you mashed potatoes, and she would, pile it on like that. And then she would take her hand, didn't wash them, take her hand, and mold them kind of into a shape. And I once had, the shape was like irregular, and I took a spoon and tried to fix it so that it would look right. And she said, no, don't touch it, that's on purpose. And I said, oh, this woman is so wonderful. Okay. I own a building lot across from my house. It's an empty building lot. And we use it as a kind of park for concerts and things like that. And when Ella would come to my house, she said, I would like to put my sculpture in there and have kids run around in it. And they could run in between the legs, and they could, play with the nose like the one in Alice in Wonderland in Central Park. The nose is always shiny on the brass piece. And we never did it. But it ain't over yet, Ella, and there's still, there's still a shot. We can still do it. So that's that. Okay, so what we can say, Ella used to teach. That's important. So Ella used to teach, she used to mentor, and that's how she was able, and with alimony, she was able to sustain her life as an artist, and only as an artist. She wore 3 hats, and what woman doesn't? It's just having a lot of stamina and energy to keep you going. Women artists on Martha's Vineyard and their works have come a long way since the last century, and it's going to be interesting to see how far we're going to go in the next century.